famous artist Pablo Picasso once declared, "I don't believe in accidents. There are only encounters in history." But he mustn't have taken the time travel I'm about to embark on. From the medieval plague that somehow turned up in 20th century Queensland, to the discovery of one of the world's greatest harbours, and the uncanny coincidence of a gun that linked two world wars.
I've got an eerie sense of déjà vu.
The same gun, the same position.
History is littered with twists of fate that, for better or worse, changed our world. Townsville in Australia's north was thriving at the turn of the 20th century. In just 35 years, it had grown from a frontier settlement into an industrial and agricultural hub with its own international port. For many locals, it would have seemed unthinkable that a devastating medieval plague could possibly enter their flourishing town. But in 1900, it did.
This is the way bubonic plague got into Townsville, on the backs of the rats that the ships were carrying. Of course, there was no proper sewage system here in those days. Raw sewage was pumped into the river, there was no clean drinking water. There would have been mounds of refuse and detritus along the banks. It was a playground for rats.
In the 14th century, bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, raged through Europe. Spread by flea-carrying rats, it killed between a third and half of the population. So when the next plague pandemic surfaced in Asia 5 centuries later, fear took hold. In 1894, the disease was identified in the city of Canton, where it killed thousands of people. From here, it spread to Hong Kong, then swept around the world on board ships. With its close proximity to Asia, it was only a matter of time before the plague would reach Australian shores. The first person to die of bubonic plague in Townsville was a night watchman who worked on the rat-infested wharves.
All in all, in the first year, 1900, 24 people got bubonic plague and 9 died. Although originally the authorities denied that it was bubonic plague. They said it was typhoid, which presumably they thought was more socially acceptable. And a lot of people think that they really underplayed the number of people who got it, but in order to prevent panic, they wouldn't admit that it was probably something like 300 people who were ill in that first year alone.
To reduce the risk of contagion, authorities placed a 6-pence bounty on rats, resulting in many hundreds being caught. But rodents weren't the only ones copping it. At that time, almost half of North Queensland's population were non-Europeans, with many working in the sugar industry. The Townsville Bulletin was blatantly racist in its reports. It is assuredly incumbent on the local authorities to carefully watch those neighbourhoods where Asiatic and Polynesians congregate. We stand in greater danger from the bubonic plague here than do other portions of Australia, because of the larger proportion of these races in our population. But one of the biggest fears at that time was not the disease itself, but the prospect of being forcibly separated from families and carted off to the quarantine hospital.
people hated the plague hospital because once you were in there, your relatives weren't allowed to come and see you. And if you died, they weren't even allowed to see the body or mourn at the funeral.
And there's a very interesting story about a guy called Henry Cockerell, whose son contracted the disease. But when the cart arrived to take him to the hospital, his father refused to let him go.
He said, "Back off, you're not taking my son away." And a big row broke up. And about 400 people gathered round his house in support of him, and eventually the police did back off. The boy was in the house, he couldn't come out, the coppers couldn't get in, until 10 days later, eventually the authorities brought in more policemen, Cockerell backed down, and the boy went off to the plague hospital. Now, fortunately, he survived and came out again, but you can imagine the kind of anger and distrust this generated in the townspeople against the people in charge.
In the end, at least 500 people died from the plague in Australia. It was finally eradicated in the 1920s, thanks to large-scale rat control and better sanitary conditions. Mind you, many more died from typhoid in the same period, not that you'd know it from the reaction at the time. For the people of Townsville, confronting the Black Death at the dawn of the 20th century was an unthinkable twist of fate. Yet for all the terror the plague caused, the outbreak has largely faded from public memory. But on my next time travel back to the 1780s, the consequences of another twist of fate would have a much more lasting impact, the foundation of one of the world's most iconic cities. In 1787, one of the world's greatest social experiments began when Captain Arthur Phillip of the British Navy set off for the other side of the world to form a penal colony. The fleet was bound for the east coast of what was then known as New Holland. Botany Bay had been earmarked by famed explorer Captain James Cook as the perfect place to establish a settlement. After 8 long months of sailing and over 20,000 kilometres, Arthur Phillip safely navigated his fleet into Botany Bay. It should have been a moment of absolute triumph, but it turned out to be the biggest anticlimax in Australian history.
This place, Botany Bay, was a big disappointment. Cook had talked up its assets, but the First Fleet found it wind-blown and swampy. The soil was sandy, the water was brackish, and the wood was so hard it was virtually impossible to cut down the trees. This was definitely not the place to build a colony if you wanted it to survive.
One of the other officers wrote, "If we're obliged to settle here, there will not be a soul alive in the course of a year." But Phillip was not about to contradict the illustrious Captain Cook. He sent work parties ashore to find a location for the settlement. Phillip must have had his doubts, though. After 4 days, he set off in search of a better option. 8 kilometres to the north lay another opening in the coastline, and what Phillip found here truly astonished him. He had stumbled onto perhaps the finest harbour in the world, where 1,000 sail of the line may ride in the most perfect security.
What puzzles me is why Cook stayed stuck down in Botany Bay and missed this fantastic harbour.
Well, Australia's so different in terms of flora and fauna from anywhere else. Sir Joseph Banks, the lofty young naturalist that was with him, discovered so many new species that's why he called it Botany Bay. And when they sailed up the coast here, past these heads, they would have thought that this was the extent of it, this little indentation in the coast. He didn't know that running away to the south was one of the great harbours on the face of the earth. And that's how it happened.
I bet, though, flashing through Philip's head was the thought, what an idiot, when he came here and saw what there was.
Well, he was very cranky at Cook's reports of Botany Bay, which proved unsuitable for a penal colony or a settlement of any kind.
Philip now had an agonising decision to make. His orders were to establish a colony at Botany Bay. But suddenly his decision was made for him. He just arrived back in Botany Bay when
one of his sailors shouted, "Another sail!" There on the horizon was the most extraordinary and unexpected sight.
the French explorer La Perouse had dropped in for an unexpected visit.
La Perouse had been bobbing up and down in the Pacific for the previous 3 years or so, mapping Korea, rounding Cape Horn, discovering the odd island or two. He knew that Philip had been ordered to bring a few settlers out here, and quite frankly, he was pretty surprised that the colony wasn't more developed. He could hardly see any houses or anything, really. As far as Philip was concerned, he'd got no idea what La Perouse was doing here. Was he spying? Did he want to set up a French colony? Whatever it was, it surely wasn't a coincidence. It was a complete mystery.
He had to act fast. What if the Frenchman found the wonderful new harbour? He took off for Port Jackson with orders for the rest of the fleet to follow him as soon as possible. He had to claim it for England.
There then followed what I think is one of the most bizarre moments in British colonial history. Imagine if Neil Armstrong had popped out of his Apollo spacecraft, walked round a crater and discovered the Russians. This was that kind of moment. So did the French and the English shake hands, fling their arms around one another and row to the shore for a party? No. The First Fleet sailed out of Botany Bay, La Perouse sailed into Botany Bay, and they barely had time to exchange the most cursory of civilities.
The French line was that La Perouse was simply looking for a safe harbour to resupply. He only stayed for 6 weeks. His 2 ships and all aboard disappeared soon after, somewhere in the Pacific. Philip was more fortunate. By switching from Botany Bay to Sydney Cove, his mission was accomplished. And the rest, as they say, is history. The discovery of Sydney Harbour was a happy accident on a monumental scale. But for my next time travel, I'm going forward 150 years to the 1940s for a much more personal twist of fate, which left a mark on dozens of soldiers' lives.
This is Brisbane City Hall, but what I wanted to show you was this. You always want to keep an eye out for one of these when you're on a walk. And down here is the basement of the City Hall, and the whole thing is undergoing a mammoth refurb at the moment. So these guys in the red day-glow jackets are engineers, architects, that sort of thing. Sorry to burst in on you unannounced, Wilder. Thanks. What intrigues me about this place is that it used to be, in the Second World War, the Red Cross tea room where young soldiers from out of town used to come for a bit of cheer and a cup of tea.
In the early 1940s, Brisbane, on Queensland's east coast, was just a big country town. But it exploded into life as thousands of Australian and American servicemen suddenly poured into the area. The troops needed rest and relaxation, and that was where the Red Cross stepped in. Enlisted men at the City Hall tea rooms would be given a welcome pack.
And among all the other goodies, there would be a pencil. And I'm going to show you what they used to do with that pencil. Lyris, would you come with me to the gentleman's toilet?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. Well, I haven't asked a young lady to do that ever. Well, certainly not since the 1960s, anyway. During the refurb, one of the first things that they had to do was hack all the plaster off the walls. And in this corridor, they were doing just that. And this was revealed. A whole wall full of Second World War soldiers' autographs. So the urinal, all the stalls were actually here, weren't they?
That's right. After the men did what they had to do, they then took out their pencils and signed their names, as young men do all around the world.
It must have been the done thing to add your name to the loo wall, but was it just an act of bravado? Or did leaving something as personal and tangible as a signature actually help the boys face an uncertain future?
Something really rather sweet and tragic about that, isn't there? Oh, there's a lieutenant there. Lieutenant, I can't read his name.
We think it's Gallon.
Yeah.
We've never been able to identify him, which means the highest ranking person on the wall that we have been able to identify is here, and it's Warrant Officer First Class Cross.
What's your favourite?
It has to be Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott is an original rat of Tobruk.
Oh, like the desert rats, the guys
Yes.
who fought in the North African
Yes.
desert.
In 1941, Australian troops held the strategic port of Tobruk against a combined German-Italian onslaught that lasted for 8 months. The Nazis nicknamed the tenacious defenders as rats, an insult the Aussies ironically embraced. Of the 14,000 Australians who served there, 800 lost their lives for the cause.
A lot of these guys must have died during the war, mustn't they?
No, they all came back alive.
How do you
There
know
are
that?
153 have been identified so far, and every single one of them has come back alive.
That's really mystic, isn't it?
It's wonderful. Yeah.
This is a great piece of history, just a snapshot in time, all these guys going off to war. I really like that. Well, thank you very much for showing me.
Welcome.
And also thank you for coming to the lab with me.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
It's a beautiful twist of fate that those soldiers' fragile scribblings on the wall list those who returned from war rather than commemorating the fallen. But then war is full of strange twists and turns. My final time travel is taking me back to 1914 for a series of events so bizarre that no one could have predicted the outcome.
'14 was the beginning of the end of innocence for Australia. There were rumblings of war from the other side of the world. The German Empire's aggressive expansionism was directly threatening the interests and the security of Great Britain. And when Mum was under threat, her young child, Australia, was ready to run to her side.
Australia had already offered up its youth for wars in the Sudan, South Africa, even the Boxer Rebellion in China. But this was the big one. Being a valued part of the Commonwealth gave the new nation security and a sense of place in the world.
When war was declared on August the 4th, 1914, even while Britain's forces were starting to mobilise, Australia was battle ready.
In fact, the first battleground of World War I wasn't mainland Europe, but thousands of miles away, here at Point Nepean in Victoria. And Major Bernie Gaynor is going to show me what happened.
So who was the first shot fired at?
The first shot was fired at a German freighter, the SS Fels.
Where was it?
The Fels was docked in Melbourne, about 80 kilometres over there. It had departed at dawn. It was coming up the South Channel.
Had war been declared?
War had been declared, but news that war had been declared had not reached here. War had been declared about 2 hours previously. Just as it was coming past here, the word came from the headquarters over at Queenscliff that war had been declared. A young officer, whose name was Veal, directed the guns to fire a warning shot across the bows of the Fels. And that's what happened.
And the guns are up here?
This gun fired at around about 2.5 hours after war was declared in London. And that is why this gun was the first gun among any of the Allied nations to fire a shot in World War I.
So did the ship stop when the gun was fired?
Well, not immediately, because the Australian pilot on the bridge, Captain Robinson,
Yes!
immediately telegraphed to the engine full astern.
Yeah.
The German, realising with horror what was happening, immediately countermarted and telegraphed full ahead. And so for a brief period there was a physical tussle.
They're wrestling on the bridge.
Wrestling on the bridge.
Robinson and the German.
Robinson and the German. They were physically fighting. Go forward, go back,
Yeah.
Stop, surrender. No, I'm not. Until finally, Captain Robinson said, if you don't stop, the next shot will be into the ship.
No, that's me. If you don't stop, the next shot will be into the ship.
Yeah, well, mine here.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. At that point, the German realised that he could do nothing. He stopped and he surrendered.
Sometimes, just sometimes, I can wear my name with pride.
The firing of the Point Nepean gun would mark the start of a worldwide conflict that would spill blood like no other. Between 1914 and 1918, 10 million soldiers would lose their lives, including 60,000 Australians. But sadly, despite all the carnage, the world superpowers weren't finished with war yet. Two decades later, they were at it again, with the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. And so too was the gun emplacement at Point Nepean.
I've got an eerie sense of déjà vu. Not only was the first shot of World War I fired from here, but the first Australian shot of World War II was fired from where?
The same gun, the same position.
How come? That is so eerie.
Indeed it was. A very strange turn of events. What happened in World War II was that war had been declared. A whole new series of regulations required of merchant vessels entering Port Phillip, and an Australian coastal vessel was trying to pass through the heads to enter into Port Phillip Bay. Signals were made, it didn't answer them, boom, a shot was fired.
Who by?
By this gun, under the direction of Commander Veal.
Commander Veal, the same bloke who'd given the order all those years previously when the shot was fired in the First World War.
Indeed. The vessel didn't answer signals that were made to it.
So he was just having a pop at some lazy Australian sailors, basically.
He was very, very cheesed off with the way the maritime fellows were not adhering to the new requirements of signalling and answering because of the declaration of war. And he said they need to learn a lesson.
And for the next 2.5 years, it was the only shot fired in anger on Australian soil. On this time travel, I've seen that the course of history can change at any time, and that a seemingly random series of events is responsible. Whether it's the chance discovery of a world-class harbour, the unexpected return of an age-old plague, or a fluke of time and place linking 2 world wars. It seems the only rational explanation can be a twist of fate.